Get out. We don't serve your kind here." The restaurant owner's voice echoed through the crowded diner as he pointed at the homeless man in torn clothes. What he didn't know was that the quiet customer in the corner booth had just recognized his former sergeant, a man who once saved his entire platoon. Hold on a minute. As you listen to that scene, what was the first thing that crossed your mind? First, write in the comments where you're listening from and what went through your mind. We give voice to forgotten heroes, and every day we share one story, but that story sometimes has the power to shake a society's conscience. If you value these stories, subscribe, hit the like button, turn on notifications, because the story about to begin isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours in downtown Portland, Oregon, turning the October afternoon into a gray canvas of misery. Steam rose from the wet pavement as people hurried past with umbrellas and turned-up collars, everyone eager to escape the cold that seemed to seep through even the thickest jackets. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison, a modest establishment that had been serving the neighborhood for over 30 years. The red brick building with its faded green awning had seen better days, but it remained a gathering place for local workers, retirees, and anyone looking for a hot meal at reasonable prices. The windows, fogged with condensation, created a warm glow that spilled onto the sidewalk, promising refuge from the relentless weather. Inside, the diner buzzed with the usual lunchtime crowd. Office workers in pressed shirts and ties occupied the counter stools, checking their phones between bites of sandwiches. A group of construction workers, their hard hats resting on an empty chair, shared jokes over steaming bowls of soup. In the far corner, an elderly couple quietly celebrated what appeared to be an anniversary, sharing a piece of apple pie. Behind the counter, Frank Murphy wiped down glasses with practiced efficiency. At 55, he had owned the diner for 8 years, having bought it from the original owner when business was struggling. Frank took pride in running what he called a respectable establishment for respectable people. His definition of respectable, however, had grown increasingly narrow over the years. Frank's graying hair was always perfectly combed, his white apron spotless despite hours of kitchen work. He kept a close eye on every customer who walked through his door, categorizing them instantly: good for business, tolerable, or unwelcome. This mental sorting system had become second nature to him, a way of protecting what he'd worked so hard to build. The bell above the door chimed softly as someone entered. Frank looked up from his cleaning, and his expression immediately darkened. Standing in the doorway was a man in his early 60s, his clothes soaked from the rain, and clearly worn beyond their intended lifespan. A faded military jacket hung loosely on his thin frame, and his boots had holes that let in the dampness of the street. The man's name was William Chen, though few people had called him by name in the past 3 years. To most, he was simply another face in the growing crowd of homeless individuals who moved through Portland's streets like ghosts. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked with them his entire life, first as a soldier, then as a carpenter, before circumstances he couldn't control took everything away. William stepped carefully inside, leaving small puddles on the worn linoleum floor. He moved with quiet dignity despite his circumstances, his posture still carrying traces of military bearing even after years of hardship. His eyes, though tired, remained alert and kind. He had learned to read rooms quickly, to sense when he was welcome and when he should leave before trouble started. The conversations in the diner didn't stop, but they quieted. Customers glanced up from their meals, some with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. A woman at table 3 moved her purse closer to her side. A businessman at the counter turned slightly away, creating an invisible barrier with his body language. William approached the counter slowly, his wet boots squeaking softly against the floor. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of crumpled bills and coins, counting them carefully in his palm. After a moment of calculation, he looked up at Frank with hopeful eyes. "Excuse me, sir," William said, his voice quiet but clear. "Could I get a cup of coffee and maybe a piece of toast? I can pay for it." Frank's jaw tightened as he looked down at the modest collection of money in William's weathered hands. Less than $3 in total, he estimated, but it wasn't about the money. Frank had built what he considered a reputation in the neighborhood, and that reputation didn't include serving people who looked like they'd been sleeping in doorways. "We're busy," Frank said curtly, not making eye contact. "Try somewhere else." William's shoulders sagged slightly, but he persisted with gentle determination. "I understand you're busy, sir. I can wait. I just need to get warm for a few minutes." The rain continued to pound against the windows, creating rivulets that caught the light from inside. Frank felt the weight of his customers' attention and knew this was a moment that would define how they saw his establishment. In his mind, allowing this man to stay would open the floodgates to others like him. Frank stepped out from behind the counter, his voice rising enough for nearby tables to hear clearly. "I said we don't serve your kind here. This is a family establishment." The diner fell completely silent. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft jazz playing from the old radio behind the counter seemed to fade into the background. William stood perfectly still, the rejected money still in his open palm. He had faced this kind of rejection many times before, but it never became easier. Each dismissal felt like another small death, another reminder of how far he had fallen from the life he once knew. "I understand," William said quietly, his voice carrying no anger, only resignation. "Thank you anyway." As William turned to leave, something stirred in the corner booth that had gone unnoticed by everyone in the diner. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rodriguez had been enjoying a quiet lunch, taking a rare break from his duties at the nearby military recruitment office. At 43, Marcus carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had seen combat and emerged stronger. His civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and khakis, belied the 2 decades of service that had shaped every aspect of his character. Marcus had been half listening to the exchange while reviewing some paperwork when something about the homeless man's voice made him look up. When William turned toward the door, Marcus saw his profile clearly for the first time, and the folder in his hand slipped to the table. The face was older, weathered by hardship and marked by years of struggle, but Marcus would recognize those eyes anywhere. Sergeant William Chen, 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment. The man who had saved Marcus's life and the lives of 12 other soldiers during a Taliban ambush in Afghanistan 15 years ago. Marcus's mind flashed back to that blazing hot day in Kandahar province when their convoy had been hit by an improvised explosive device. In the chaos that followed, with enemy fire coming from 3 directions and half their unit wounded, it was Sergeant Chen who had maintained control. While bullets whistled overhead, Chen had systematically organized the evacuation of wounded soldiers, making multiple trips across open ground under heavy fire. When young Lieutenant Rodriguez had been pinned down by sniper fire, it was Chen who had crawled through the rubble to reach him, dragging him to safety while enemy rounds struck the ground inches from their bodies. Chen had saved every member of that unit that day, though he took shrapnel in his shoulder that would bother him for the rest of his life. Now 15 years later, Marcus watched in stunned silence as this war hero was being thrown out of a diner like unwanted trash. Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding as the full weight of recognition settled over him. The paperwork scattered across his table, but he paid no attention to the falling documents. His eyes were fixed on William, who had reached the door and was about to step back into the cold rain. "Sergeant Chen." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the complete silence of the diner, they carried clearly across the room. William stopped with his hand on the door handle, his body went rigid, and he turned slowly, his eyes searching the crowd of faces until they found Marcus in the corner booth. For a long moment, the 2 men simply stared at each other across the small restaurant. Recognition dawned slowly in William's tired eyes, followed by something that looked almost like relief. Here was someone who knew him not as a homeless vagrant, but as the soldier he had once been. Marcus walked toward William with measured steps, his eyes never leaving his former sergeant's face. The other customers watched in confused silence, sensing they were witnessing something significant, but not understanding what. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," William said quietly, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Sir, it's Lieutenant Colonel now," Marcus said, stopping just a few feet away, "and don't you dare call me sir. Not after what you did for all of us." Frank, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion and irritation, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I already told this man he needs to leave." Marcus turned toward Frank, and the restaurant owner immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. There was something in the military officer's eyes that made Frank take an unconscious step backward. "Do you know who this man is?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the entire diner. Frank shrugged, trying to maintain his earlier bravado. "Some homeless guy trying to get a free meal." Marcus's expression hardened. "This man is Sergeant William Chen, United States Army. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan and saved the lives of 13 American soldiers, including mine." The silence in the diner deepened. Every customer was now completely focused on the drama unfolding before them. Several people had quietly pulled out their phones, though none were yet recording. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "On August 15, 2009, our convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. Enemy fighters had us pinned down with small arms fire and RPGs. While most of us were focused on staying alive, Sergeant Chen crawled through enemy fire, not once, not twice, but 6 separate times to pull wounded soldiers to safety. William stood silently, his eyes focused on the floor. He had never been comfortable with praise or recognition, even when he was at his peak. When I was pinned down by sniper fire, Marcus continued, this man risked his own life to reach me. He dragged me to cover while bullets were hitting the ground around us. The medic said later that I would have bled out in another 10 minutes. Frank's confidence was beginning to crumble. He looked around the diner and saw that every face was now focused on him, with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. I didn't know, Frank said weakly. He didn't say anything about being in the military. He shouldn't have to, Marcus replied sharply. But since you need to hear it, Sergeant Chen was awarded the Bronze Star with valor for his actions that day. He also received 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained while serving his country. A woman at table 5 spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. My son served in Afghanistan. He never came home. She stood and walked toward William, extending her hand. Thank you for your service. One by one, other customers began to stand. The construction workers approached, their earlier jokes forgotten. The elderly couple shuffled over, the woman's eyes bright with tears. The businessman who had turned away earlier now stepped forward with obvious shame on his face. I'm sorry, the businessman said to William. I'm sorry for not recognizing what you've done for all of us. Frank found himself standing alone behind his counter, watching as his customers surrounded the man he had tried to throw out into the rain. The respect and gratitude they were showing William made Frank's earlier treatment of him appear even more callous and shameful. Marcus placed a gentle hand on William's shoulder. How long have you been on the streets? William's voice was barely audible. 3 years. Lost my job when the construction company went under. Couldn't make rent. Medical bills from an old injury. He trailed off, not wanting to burden anyone with the details of his downward spiral. That injury, Marcus said knowingly. The shrapnel from Kandahar. William nodded. Sometimes it acts up, makes it hard to work certain jobs. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, not at William, but at a system that had failed one of its most deserving heroes. Where are you staying? Shelter when there's space, bridge sometimes when there's not. The construction worker, a man named Tommy with arms like tree trunks and a heart bigger than his frame, stepped forward. I run a crew downtown. We could use someone with experience. Housing comes with the job if you're interested. An older woman who had been quietly listening spoke up. I run a veteran services office 6 blocks from here. We can help with benefits, medical care, housing assistance, everything you should have been getting all along. Frank watched this outpouring of support and felt something shifting inside him. The man he had dismissed as worthless was being treated like a hero by his own customers. More than that, he was a hero. Frank's face burned with shame as he realized how completely he had misjudged the situation. Marcus turned back to Frank, his expression stern but not hostile. Sergeant Chen came in here asking for a cup of coffee and a piece of toast. He had money to pay for it. He was polite and respectful. And you threw him out because of how he looked. Frank felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant. His carefully maintained reputation was crumbling, but for the first time in years, he was seeing the situation clearly. I made a mistake, he said quietly. You made more than a mistake, said the woman whose son had died in Afghanistan. You disrespected a man who fought for your freedom to run this place. Frank looked at William, who was still standing quietly, accepting the kindness of strangers with the same dignity he had shown when facing rejection. Sergeant Chen, Frank said, his voice breaking slightly. I owe you an apology. William looked up, his expression free of anger or resentment. Everyone makes mistakes. No, Frank said firmly. This wasn't a mistake. This was wrong. I judged you based on your appearance instead of seeing who you really are. He paused, struggling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. My father served in Vietnam. He came home to people spitting on him, calling him names. I swore I'd never treat a veteran that way. And yet, the silence stretched as Frank grappled with the full weight of what he had done. Sergeant Chen, Frank continued, I'd like to offer you something more than just coffee and toast. How about a full meal on the house? And iced tea to... How about a full meal on the house? And he looked around at his customers, then back at William. How about a job? I could use help in the kitchen, and there's a small apartment upstairs that hasn't been used in years. William's eyes widened in surprise. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Frank said quickly. I need reliable help, and something tells me a man who saved 13 lives in Afghanistan can handle whatever my kitchen throws at him. Marcus smiled for the first time since recognizing his old sergeant. Frank, I think you just made the best hiring decision of your life. The construction worker, Tommy, laughed. Guess I'm too late with my job offer. But the offer stands if you ever want to build things instead of cook them. As the crowd around William began to disperse, returning to their tables with their meals cold but their hearts warm, Marcus remained by his former sergeant's side. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" Marcus asked quietly. "To the unit, to the VA, to me?" William was quiet for a long moment. "Pride, I guess. Didn't want anyone to see me like this. You all had lives to live, careers to build. Didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Marcus shook his head. "Bill, you saved my life. Every promotion I've earned, every mission I've completed, every day I've spent with my family, all of that exists because of what you did. You could never be a burden." Marcus pulled out his wallet and retrieved a business card. "This has my direct number. I want you to call me tomorrow. There are benefits you're entitled to, medical care you should be receiving, programs designed specifically for veterans like you." Frank appeared beside them carrying a steaming plate of food, pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes and a dinner roll that was still warm from the oven. "Sergeant Chen, your table is ready." He led William to the best table in the house, the one by the window with a view of the street. Frank poured fresh coffee into a clean mug and set it down carefully. "I'll start you at $15 an hour," Frank said, "plus tips, plus the apartment upstairs. You'll have your own entrance, your own kitchen. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." William looked down at the plate of food, then up at Frank's earnest face. "Why? An hour ago you wanted me gone." Frank sat down across from him. "An hour ago I was a smaller man than I am now. Sometimes it takes being confronted with real courage to recognize your own cowardice." As William began to eat his first hot meal in days, Marcus sat beside him, and the two veterans talked quietly about the years that had passed. Around them the normal sounds of the diner gradually returned, conversations resuming, silverware clinking against plates, the soft jazz from the radio. But something fundamental had changed. The elderly woman who ran the Veteran Services office left her card on the table. The construction workers left their foreman's number. Even the businessman who had initially turned away left a note with his information, offering networking opportunities and professional references. By the time William finished his meal, he had more than just a job and a place to live. He had been reminded that his service mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that sometimes the very people you serve will surprise you with their capacity for both cruelty and redemption. As the afternoon rain finally began to let up, casting filtered sunlight through the diner's windows, William Chen sat at his table feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years: hope. Frank Murphy stood behind his counter, watching his newest employee finish his meal, and realized that sometimes the best thing that can happen to a business is having your assumptions challenged by someone who's earned the right to be treated with respect. And Marcus Rodriguez returned to his corner booth, gathered his scattered paperwork, and made a mental note to call his old unit. Because if William Chen had fallen through the cracks, there might be others who needed to be found, reminded of their worth, and welcomed home properly. The sign outside Murphy's diner still read Family Restaurant, but inside, the definition of family had just expanded to include anyone who had served, anyone who had sacrificed, and anyone willing to see beyond appearances to recognize the heroes who walk among us every day. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields. Sometimes they're fought in small diners on rainy afternoons, where courage is measured not by medals earned, but by the willingness to admit when you're wrong and do better. And sometimes, just sometimes, everyone wins. Share this story and click the notification bell so you can be immediately notified of these stories we publish every day. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow I have another story especially for you.